Kia ora, and welcome to the programme. You're watching GREG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, based here in New Zealand. My name's Ian Kaplan, and this is episode 2 of the 7 webinars that, taken together, form the 2021 annual GREG conference. The topic, conversations that help regulatory practice and regulatory stewardship. These public webinars go out live and indeed later recorded on the GREG website. Do please, if you haven't already looked at the catalogue of future programmes, please do jump on and register. Wherever, and indeed given the time and given the place where you may be watching us, closer or slightly further from Christmas, wherever and whenever you are, it's always part of the case at this conference, as it was when we had webinars last year, that you're very welcome here. I'm now about to put on a sailor's hat, and this is utterly rationally connected to the business of the conference, because I've mentioned that there are 7 webinars. There are also 5 films, and a motif of those 5 films on conversations is a Port and Harbour Marine Safety Code here in New Zealand, which is an apex model of regulatory stewardship, regulatory practice, and local and central government, and also policy and regulatory design collaboration, all of which the code appears in the films in varying or lesser degrees. They will be released sequentially tomorrow, and you'll see those in the conference programme. Do please tune in. If you have registered for the conference, we'll do sweep up messages so that you are tipped off when these 5 get put across onto the site. These are 12 items which, taken together, are all about the sort of conversations that make regulatory practice and regulatory stewardship work. And today's conversation is the governance conversation, governance conversations. The conversations on the bridge at the helm that keep regulatory stewardship going. The nautical jokes I'm going to abandon because they're somebody else's, and that will be an act of comedic piracy. I say no more than that. I'm going to ask our moderator for today to introduce our distinguished guest panelists, 3 chief executives, more fully. My own chief executive and also deputy secretary, who just seen me wear a sailor's hat, and I hope that I won't be having to write my CV, and I don't mean CV shortly after this webinar. I'll be back in half an hour, but I'll hand you straight over to Melanie Porter, who's the Deputy Secretary of Strategic Policy Programmes here at GREG's Secretariat Ministry, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Enjoy, members of the audience, and Mel, kia ora, and over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Tēnā koutou katoa, tālofa lava. I'm honoured to moderate today's webinar, Achieving Regulatory Systems That Benefit New Zealanders, a leadership conversation. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists today, I thought we would start off with a whakatauki. I'm waiting for the slide. So our whakatauki for today for reflection is "Ma te huruhuru ka rere te manu, adorn the bird with feathers so it may soar." If regulatory stewardship is a bird, what are the feathers of leadership, learning, and practice that we need to have to enable our bird to soar? I'll leave that for you all to digest as we hear from our esteemed panelists, who I'll now introduce. We've got Carolyn Tremain, Secretary for Hikina Whakatutuki, otherwise known as the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Carolyn has more than 20 years of experience being a leader of large, complex organization. She's also my chief executive, and she's a member of the Regulatory Stewardship Chief Executives Group. Carolyn champions regulatory stewardship here at MB. We've also got Keith Manch, Chief Executive for the Civil Aviation Authority. Keith is a partner in the GREG initiative. He's got rich experience as a regulator and robust understanding of what it takes to lead the regulation of complex systems. Gaye Searancke, Secretary for Land Information New Zealand. Gaye joined LINZ in August 2019 from Inland Revenue. She's previously held senior roles in ACC and at Hikina Whakatutuki. She was also my boss, and has a background in policy and legal leadership. As Chief Executive, Gaye is leading LINZ's drive to embed regulatory stewardship into the way they work to improve the value LINZ delivers for New Zealand and mitigate the effects of regulatory underperformance. Our panelists bring a wealth of experience, as many of you might already know, to the system leadership discussion. I'd also like to note that this is one of the most popular Webinar sessions, we had 549 registered across 72 agencies. So thank you for your passion about the bird. And let's listen to what those feathers might be. Before I go into some of the introductory remarks, members of the audience, we've got a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'd like you to use that to write down your questions throughout the discussion. There's time for 3 or 4 questions after we hear from the panelist. And if you put a thumbs up against the questions that you really like, they will become top rated, and we'll have those questions at the end of the panelist discussion. Without further ado, why does regulatory system leadership matter? Leadership is key to ensuring our regulatory systems are resilient and deliver outcomes for New Zealanders. It ensures our systems are fit for purpose to respond to unforeseen crises. We know there can be terrible harm caused when regulatory leadership isn't in place. If you recall the 2008 financial crisis, which was felt throughout the world, financial regulators and institutions failed to recognize the hazard of high-risk lending practices, and it went catastrophically wrong. That's why regulatory system leadership matters. The New Zealand government, in response to the global crisis, formed the Council of Financial Regulators, bringing together the key financial agencies to ensure effective and responsive regulation of the financial system in New Zealand. To support regulatory system leadership and governance, MB recently published guidance on regulatory system governance. I'm sure you've all read this. System governance is all about working on the system rather than in it. Leading a system by looking ahead and working across. It also raises the question, though, for us of regulatory system leadership and how to do this well. That's the topic of today. The leadership challenges for achieving systems that protect New Zealanders. So Carolyn, Keith, and Gaye, as chief executives of New Zealand regulatory agencies, it's your role to drive leadership in your agencies. System leadership is at the core of what you and your agencies need to deliver to achieve regulatory systems that benefit New Zealanders. So question 1, what are the qualities needed to be a successful regulatory system leader? Gaye, would you like to start on your views?
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Mel. Well, that's a great question to start with. Thanks for choosing me first. Thinking about this question, I think the first thing I would like to put on the table really is the courage that's required to be a regulatory system leader. And that involves, I guess, the ability to lift oneself or oneselves out of the day-to-day role of regulation and to try and take an outside-in view wherever possible. So I think as regulators and working in government, we have a lot of information and demands and activity happening within our world or our bubble, as the new COVID phrases. And I think an outside-in view of how regulatory systems are performing is really important in understanding the risks and to understand whether the objectives of the regulatory design are being met. So the courage to step outside the comfort of being a regulator and an expert within the system and moving externally to talk to people that you would not normally talk to have an open ear and understand the external viewpoint on how regulatory systems are performing. Because let's face it, I think in every one of the regulatory system failures that we've seen across the world and in New Zealand, there were murmurings and information in the system that for whatever reason didn't elevate to the level of attention that would have prevented system failure. So I think that's the first thought that I'd put on the table, courage.
Thank you, Gaye. Carolyn, what's your take on this?
Tēnā koutou katoa, and wonderful to be here on the panel today. And thank you, Mel, for the question. Look, I think good regulation is always about balance, because good regulation requires it to be easy for people to do, but equally it has to have sanctions when people don't do the right thing. And making sure that we have that balance between making sure that people can get the information they need, that the systems are easily accessed, that they're intuitive to the extent that we can do that in government circles all the time. It can be a bit of a challenge in of itself. I also think that it's very seldom regulatory systems are solely within one agency. An agency has a lead on it, but often the behaviour that we see of an organisation or an individual is common across different agencies and different regulatory systems. So sometimes I think we have to think about not only the purpose and the intent of our own regulatory system, but how it interconnects with other agencies, how we can learn from other parts of the regulatory system of government to inform and look to the future. The final thing I'd say is I'd echo a little bit of what Gaye said. You do have to take a holistic and outside-in approach. And some of that is because business doesn't stay static, or the regulatory system that people experience, their world changes and our world changes. And sometimes we need to keep iterating, keep looking to the future and aspire to make regulatory systems more effective. And that's a combination of the systems that people use in the system, as well as the way in which we as regulators actually manage the system as a whole. So a few thoughts from me, Mel.
Thank you, Carolyn. So Keith, we've heard about courage, balance, taking a holistic and outside-in approach. What's your view in relation to the qualities needed to be a successful regulatory system leader?
Thanks, Mel. Yeah, and it's good to be here with Carolyn and Gaye, engaging in this very important discussion. I'll go back to the Productivity Commission's report in 2014, which quoted a submission from Minter Ellis and Rudd Watts, actually. It focused on organisation, but it is equally applicable to system. It said that leadership has a significant influence on the culture of an organisation. A good leader of a regulatory agency will encourage a productive and collaborative multidisciplinary team environment within the organisation, and effective two-way communication with external stakeholders. That's a key building block to ensure regulation is informed by the best available evidence. Now, it referred to an organisation, but if we think of the whole of government as an organisation, it's equally applicable how we work across government, central and local government. So it really focuses on culture, which I'd add to the list that Carolyn and Gaye have already spoken about. And it's about productive, collaborative teams, two-way communication, having a system context. It's also about a long-term view and resilience, and recognising there are different ways of thinking and doing things that are required to take that approach. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. A lot of food for thought. So is working on systems different to working in agencies and functions? Gaye?
Thanks, Mel. Yeah, I think working on systems is a fundamentally a different thing to working within a specific regulatory role, or even within an agency. Really just because of the fact that you really have to lift up and look at and understand all parts of the system and the role that you play in it. So you have to really go beyond the boundaries of what you may be responsible for as a part of that system. And I think that is the key difference for us as regulatory system leaders, is to understand that all of us in some way are performing a role in that system, but it's also our job to lift ourselves up out of that specific role and those boundaries, and to understand how the whole system is working. And as Carolyn said, the interconnectedness between regulatory systems, which is, can be quite complex, but absolutely critical to how they work. So I think understanding that you are one component working in an agency of a system inevitably, and sometimes part of quite a complex system, and that it's incumbent on us to gain that understanding of how we fit into something that's bigger than us, to make the best of both our own contribution to it, but to have a picture on the performance as a whole. So I think that, that perspective is fundamentally different from working within an agency in part of a system.
Thank you, Gaye. Carolyn, how do you think about, I guess, the relativity, but working in an agency relative to a system view?
Yeah, I mean, I sit on quite a few system regulatory focused committees and boards. One of them is the Financial Markets Conduct Regulatory System, and we form as a group of agencies the Council of Financial Regulators. So that includes my colleagues at the Reserve Bank, the Financial Markets Authority, the Commerce Commission and the Treasury. And two of those entities are not core public sector entities, but collectively the four agencies oversee the financial regulatory work and market conduct work in New Zealand. And so MB in that context has quite a narrow view of the regulatory system, but actually we're an important component of the whole system and how it operates. So in this forum, we don't think so much about MB's contribution to the system, but how the individual parts actually come together to make a much larger whole. And I think that's the most important thing. When I think about why it's important for me to spend time in that forum, it's about thinking about the events that occur if we don't have that kind of leadership for communities in New Zealand. And you opened with some of the opening comments about the financial crisis that occurred in 2010. And of course, many of these institutions and regulatory system changes have become part of the way we do work today because of the catastrophic impacts that occurred in the past. And so learning from the past, I think, is something that's also quite important for us not to forget about. Thanks, Mel.
Keith, let's hear from you. What are your views?
Yeah, thank you. It builds on what's been said already, really, but a simple kind of analogy or picture, it's like the difference between being on the ground looking at some trees compared to flying over the forest, looking at the whole system. And regulatory stewardship is actually a relationship-based activity, and I think both Gaye and Carolyn have alluded to that in their comments. Obviously, then it involves political considerations, both big and small and big P, in terms of organisational politics and the like. It's about being outside the bounds of your organisation, and it's about seeing up, out, and across. Recognising you're part of something bigger. I'd put it a little bit like a simple negotiating model, really. People have positions, they have issues, and they have interests. When you get together, it's a really important thing to focus on the common interests and then act on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. I'm just conscious that there are quite a few questions that everybody is keen to hear from the panelists from. And I thought I'd actually go straight to some of those questions, if that's okay with the panel. So the top question at the moment is, with respect to regulatory stewardship in New Zealand, what's keeping you all awake at night? And what are the key concerns in relation to those things keeping you awake? Keith, I'll change the sequencing. What's keeping you awake at night?
Oh, I think there's a general expectation or growing expectation on regulators to get things right all of the time. And we all know that the environment we're in at the moment puts an enormous amount of stress and strain on us to even get the basics right. Sometimes there's pressure on us in terms of policy settings, on the resources available to do the work, and there's pressure on the people. All the people in our organisations are suffering from COVID just like everybody else is. And we've got very high expectations. So there's a lot of empathy required, both in terms of internally inside the organisations and in terms of the regulated parties that we engage with. So getting that balance right, meeting expectations, but not driving people into the ground is really critical.
Thank you.
I might add to that if I could, Mel, because it's a really interesting question. And Keith raised COVID. And I'm sure many of the people attending this webinar today will have seen within their organisations restrictions on field work being done, audits having to be done desktop or by Zoom. And I do worry about whether that is in some way starting to compromise our feel for the regulatory system. So some of our frontline people have a very good feel and understanding when things are almost to a point they can intuitively feel it's not quite right. And I worry at the moment with COVID, with the extended time of lockdowns that we have all had over the last 2 years, that we've had a little bit of undermining of some of our regulatory systems. And that's something that I think we are going to see as a legacy, just one of the legacies of COVID, is how do we actually get back on top of a lot of our regulatory work. Thanks, Mel.
Thanks, Carolyn. Gaye, what's keeping you up at night?
Yeah, I want to build on what Carolyn said. I think it's just such a timely observation. And my point about really what keeps me up at night thinking about the regulatory systems that I'm involved in, for example, which is for that Toitū Te Whenua Land Information New Zealand operates within, is to understand those small bits of intel or the vibe or the feeling that I think Carolyn referred to, that our people who are intricately involved in regulatory systems, that they develop over time and through relationships, as Keith mentioned. And as the distancing or the less frequency of interactions perhaps, or maybe some of the normal signals that we would see, as those diminish, I think we lose a little bit of our agility and our ability to respond at the right time and in the right way. And the thing I get concerned about with regulatory systems is that in hindsight, it's very easy to see all the pointers or markers along the way to a regulatory failure or a regulatory problem in a system. The absolute trick is to see those in the time as they emerge and to be able to respond at the right time to them. And my fear is that for whatever reason, distraction, not understanding the significance of some of these pointers, or maybe lack of engagement with the wider system itself, we miss those signals, and then we end up dealing with much more extreme failures or worse consequences. And when in hindsight, hindsight vision being 2020, we could see all of those coming along the path. So that's the thing that I think about quite a lot.
Thank you, Gaye. We've got another question from Wendy, which is quite practical in terms of we get to them. So going beyond the boundaries of what you are responsible for and thinking about regulatory stewardship, what does that look like in practice? Since we've got you on screen, Gaye, think about, can you give us an example of what going beyond the boundaries of what you are responsible for in the regulatory stewardship space looks like?
Yeah, that's a great question and practical one, because it's not just about intention, it's what do you actually do that makes a difference. I think an example is, I'll think about the rating valuation system, which is part of our property information regulatory system in LINZ. And we have a role as the regulator, the Valuer General has a role, but the participants in that system are all of the rating entities, i.e. the councils in New Zealand, and all the providers valuers who do all that work. And going beyond your own role, which is the role of approving rating valuations, for example, to a regulatory system perspective, which we try very hard to take, is to look at how that whole market is performing. What is the relationship between the councils and their providers? What's the capacity of the providers? And what are the drivers for them who are operating in a competitive market to provide their services? And what can we see from our part of the system when we look at it much more broadly that may be driving the outcomes that the Valuer General sees? So that means conversations with some of the provider businesses about the quality of their work. It means talking to the boards of some of those entities. It means having quite upfront conversations with some of the councils who are commissioning the work, none of which in an obvious way is any of our business, but those conversations are really valuable because they create a broader understanding of how the system is working within all participants. And it can be quite daunting to go along and talk to a board in a commercial entity that's providing services to a council and ask, well, what does your government department have to do with this? So I think that's a practical example of what getting outside your comfort zone and your job might look like.
Thank you, Gaye. I just got told we've got 3 minutes left for Q&A, so I'm just going to change tact a little bit here and go to the next question, which is very popular. 22 people had thumbs up from Grant. As a regulatory leader, what is one thing you wish you knew on day one when you started leading a regulatory agency? Could I ask Keith?
Day one for me was about 35 years ago, so I don't quite remember. But the importance of, it's the theme of the discussion, it's the importance of systems thinking and understanding that the world isn't your organisation or even the statute, far from it. Going to Carolyn's example about the Financial Council, you've got to play across to actually succeed with anything. And I sort of list three things. One is understanding it's about outcomes, not outputs. Another one that it's about leadership, not management. And the third one is that it's about systems, not statutes or organisations.
Mel,
jump
in and
yes,
I'm just going to jump in and say the thing that I wished I had known was how you can use other organisations to partner with you to achieve what I kind of talk about as an amplification of our own regulatory scope, and using people like councils or people like accountants or business advisors, and how you can actually just get more of a ripple effect, because what we're trying to do with regulatory systems is often shaping people's norms of behaviour. And the more kind of points of interaction they have, the more reinforcing that is.
One more. Thank you, Carolyn. We're going to have to head back to, I guess, digesting and reflecting on all of the feathers, I think, that we've heard today from our esteemed panel. And there's a lot of food for thought here in terms of regulatory system leadership. And I'm going to further reflect on what we've heard from the panel as well as part of regulatory practice, both in the, I guess, the component of the system that I'm in, but figuring out what that means for the broader system leadership work that we've been talking about today. So on that note, I would like to thank the panelists, thank our audience for their passion and commitment to regulatory stewardship and for the questions, and then pass back to Ian. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you very much, Mel. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Gaye. Thank you, Carolyn. And thank you, Keith. That's a masterclass and a very, very special treat for this audience. Lots to unpack there, members of the audience. I'm sure you'll agree. I also can't let go unmentioned, these things don't come out of a magic wand, the work of Rebecca Foley, Karen Berlin, and also Antonia Azzato in really bringing this together and getting this good work done. There's plenty more where that came from. You will see this webinar again closer to Christmas. We're going to do the kind of box set in December, and it's definitely something that's got a lot of material in it. It's definitely worth a further look. Don't forget the films are out tomorrow and the subsequent 3 days. And the next episode of webinars is about international digital conversations on Friday. So in the meantime, from all of us here, stay safe, stay well, take care, and ka kite anō.